All right, welcome everyone to Turkish Law Talks. We are kicking off a brand new deep dive today, and this time we're taking a journey into the fascinating world of Turkish constitutional law.
Yes, we are.
And we're starting right at the very beginning, kind of like laying the groundwork. Our awesome listeners have been super curious about the origins of the Turkish legal system, so we're going to check out two pretty crucial historical documents. The Sened-i İttifak, which translates to the Charter of Alliance, and the Tanzimat Fermani, or the Edict of Tanzimat.
Yeah, these are like, think of them as the early blueprints, the very first sketches that shaped what Turkish law would eventually become.
Exactly. And we're super lucky to have some excerpts from lecture1.pdf, which lays out like a really neat overview of these foundational texts.
Yeah, it's a really solid starting point.
So our main goal today is to break down these documents, like what were they all about? Who did they aim to serve? And like the biggest question of all, why did they even matter in the grand scheme of Turkish constitutionalism?
Yeah, those are the big questions we're going to tackle. It's going to be a journey through history for sure.
Totally. We're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of each document, looking at, how they try to balance power and those early ideas about rights that they brought to the table. You guys ready for some surprising details and a way clearer picture of these turning points?
I'm ready.
Awesome. Let's jump right into it, starting with the Sened-i İttifak, the Charter of Alliance.
All right, Charter of Alliance. So this thing was signed back in 1808. And it's got this like pretty clear-cut structure. We start with an intro called the debase in Turkish, followed by a whole set of 7 conditions, or shart as they're called, and then it wraps up with one appendix, the zel.
7 conditions.
Yeah.
That's quite a bit to unpack. So right off the bat, it seems like this charter was trying to figure out this whole power struggle, right? You've got the Sultan, the local bigwigs, the ayan, and then also the everyday folks. It wasn't just a simple top-down thing, was it?
Not at all. It was like a balancing act, trying to get everyone on the same page. And if you look at those conditions, you can see that. Like right from the get-go, the first condition makes it super clear. Everyone who signed this thing had to accept the authority of the Sultan, the Padishah, and of course the authority of the state itself.
Yeah, that's laying down the law right there.
Right. And not only that, but it went on to say that if anyone dared to go against the Sultan's orders, well, the whole alliance would come down on them.
Wow, talk about a united front. So it was all about making sure the Sultan's word was law.
Well, it was a big part of it, for sure. But it wasn't just the Sultan calling all the shots. Condition 4 brought in the Grand Vizier, the Sadrazam, and made it clear that his commands were to be followed just like they were coming straight from the Sultan himself.
So it was like creating this super direct chain of command.
Yeah, exactly. No room for confusion there. And then when it came to money matters, Condition 3 stepped in and basically said, hey, everyone's got to stick to their financial commitments and those tax collection orders. Like the central government needed that cash flow to keep things running smoothly.
Makes sense. And then there were those conditions about military obedience to the Sultan, right?
Oh yeah, that's in Conditions 1, 2, and 6. And what's really striking is that these regional power players, they actually pledged to squash any uprisings in the capital, even without getting the okay from the Sultan beforehand. It's like they were really worried about keeping things under control.
Yeah, definitely shows you how fragile the whole power balance was back then, right? The Sultan needed these regional guys on his side, not turning into potential rivals.
Absolutely. And then we also see this limit placed on the influence of those ayan, the local notables, in Condition 5. They were pretty much told to stay in their own lanes and not meddle outside their territories. It seems like the Sultan wanted to rein them in a bit.
Right, like let's keep everyone in their designated power zones.
It was all about boundaries, I guess.
Totally. It was about keeping that balance, that careful dance between central authority and regional power. But, it wasn't all about the Sultan tightening his grip. The charter also had provisions that were good for the notables themselves, like in Condition 4. We talked about how it emphasized obedience to the Grand Vizier, but it also threw in a pretty big check on his power.
Oh, interesting. What kind of check?
Well, basically, the notables, they all agreed to team up and stop the Grand Vizier from doing anything that was, out of line, unfair, or went against their religious beliefs. It gave them a way to push back if they felt like things were getting out of hand. Like, this wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was recognizing that the Sultan's power wasn't absolute. He had to play ball with these powerful figures, too. It was a shift in, how power worked, even if it didn't last that long. That is so fascinating. It wasn't just one-sided at all. And Condition 5 goes even further with that, right? It talks about protecting these innocent dynasties, right?
Yeah, innocent dynasties. It's an interesting term, right? But basically, what it meant was that if someone from one of these powerful families was accused of doing something wrong, well, nobody could just barge in and punish them. There had to be a proper investigation first, and even then, the Grand Vizier had to give the thumbs up. It's like a really early form of due process for these elite families.
Almost like they had their own legal system in a way.
In a way, yeah. And that whole idea of dynastic rights, it's super important in this document. Condition 5 talks about protecting the Ayans families even after they die. And it acknowledges that these major notables had the right to protect the people under their rule. So it's like boosting their authority at the local level big time.
So it's not just about the Sultan grabbing more power. It's also about legitimizing the power these regional figures already had.
Yeah. Exactly. It's like this two-way street, a power-sharing agreement. Now, what about the regular folks, the Riaya? Did the charter do anything for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, where did they fit into all of this?
Well, Condition 7 is the one that really focuses on their well-being. It's all about protecting the general population, especially the poor and those who were like under the authority of the Sultan. And it says straight up that taxes have to be fair. They can't be oppressive or crushing the people.
That's a pretty big deal, right? Fair taxation.
Totally. It acknowledges that treating people fairly is important. And it wasn't just about taxes either. If you look at Conditions 5 and 7 together, they show this shared commitment to preventing oppression. Like, everyone's got to play a part in stopping those who are abusing their power and going against the religious laws.
So it's about shared responsibility, not just the Sultan as the sole protector.
Yeah, exactly. And then Condition 5 also brings in this idea that, before you punish someone, you got to investigate. It can't be arbitrary. While this might have been mainly to protect the notables, it probably helped out the regular folks too, because it meant they couldn't just get punished for no reason.
So looking at this Sened-i İttifak, the Charter of Alliance as a whole, it's super intricate, trying to juggle all these different power dynamics, right? It wasn't a modern constitution, but our lecture notes say it's like a constitutional document in a material sense.
Hmm.
Could you explain that a bit more? Because it was this covenant. The notables actually had some say, right? It wasn't just the Sultan calling the shots. They had to agree to it, which I guess means it had a different kind of legitimacy.
Yeah, that's a great point. You hit the nail on the head. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of a modern constitution, all that fancy language and structure, but it does have these provisions that put limits on the Sultan's power. And, even if it's not super obvious, it recognizes some rights and freedoms for different groups in society.
So it's about the substance of what it does
Yeah.
rather than just the format, right?
Exactly. And it's a huge deal in Turkish constitutional history. Most people see it as the first real step towards moving away from like absolute power and towards having the rule of law. It's about rules, not just the whims of a ruler.
Yeah, that's massive. And the lecture notes call it a covenant-type document, which I thought was interesting. It's like, it wasn't just the Sultan saying, okay, here are the rules, follow them. It was more like a two-way agreement.
It's more like a negotiation, right? Like a bunch of powerful landowners and the king sitting down and hammering out a deal where everyone gets something they want. Think of it like, back in those days, the Sultan couldn't just dictate everything. He needed these notables on his side. They had resources, influence, so it had to be this kind of give and take situation.
Yeah, it makes sense. It really shows how power dynamics were changing even back then. But the lecture also mentions that actually putting the charter into practice was a total mess. Was there anyone, even at the time, who saw this document as, like, not good enough or just too reliant on powerful individuals to ever really work?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, in theory, it was groundbreaking, but in reality, it didn't quite live up to the hype. A big reason for that was the assassination of Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, the guy who was like the mastermind behind it all. He gets killed shortly after it's signed, and boom, the whole thing loses its momentum.
Oh, wow. So it's basically doomed from the start. That's tragic.
Pretty much. Without its main champion, it just fizzled out. And that appendix that said every new Grand Vizier and Sheikh al-Islam had to sign off on it, yeah, that never really happened after Alemdar Mustafa Pasha was gone.
So despite being this super important first step towards, like, a constitutional system, it was kind of a fleeting moment, wasn't it?
Yeah, its time in the spotlight was short-lived, but hey, even if it wasn't super successful in practice, it still holds a lot of symbolic importance. It showed that people were starting to think about limiting power and having a system based on rules.
Right. The ideas were there, even if putting them into action was tough. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Sened-i İttifak. Now let's fast forward a bit and check out the Tanzimat Fermani, the Edict of Tanzimat. This one pops up a few decades later, and it seems to have a totally different vibe, doesn't it?
It does. It's like a whole new chapter in the story of Turkish constitutionalism. The Edict of Tanzimat came out in 1839, and it's another big deal, even though it wasn't a formal constitution either. But unlike the Charter of Alliance, which was all about negotiations and agreements, the Edict of Tanzimat was more like a, hey, this is what I, the Sultan, am declaring kind of thing.
So more top-down, less back and forth.
Exactly. And the lecture notes say that the principles in the edict can be grouped into two main buckets. One is all about how state power works and what its limits are, and the other is about basic rights and freedoms. Let's start with the power stuff.
Okay, let's do it. What's the main gist on the power front?
So the edict kicks off by saying that the government has to follow the law. Like, it's not just the Sultan making stuff up as he goes along. The public sphere, everything that affects people's lives, has to be governed by laws that are actually written down. And if anyone, even a big shot, tries to do something that breaks the law, well, they're going to get in trouble.
Ooh, everyone's accountable, even the VIPs. That's pretty radical for that time.
Right. It's this huge push towards having a system where everyone plays by the same rules. And then there's also this thing about state spending. The edict basically says, hey, we can't just be throwing money around. Everything the government spends has to be legal and accounted for.
It's like early transparency and accountability in government finances.
Yeah, exactly. No more shady deals happening behind closed doors. And they also got rid of the whole punishing people without a fair trial thing. The edict says that everyone deserves a proper trial that's open to the public. No more secret kangaroo courts.
That's huge in terms of like protecting people from being unjustly accused or punished, right? So much more fair and transparent.
Oh, for sure. It's a major step forward in terms of justice. And then we move into those principles about rights and freedoms. This is where the edict really changes things up. The lecture talks a lot about this principle of equality before the law. It's like a cornerstone of this whole Tanzimat reform movement.
Equality before the law. That's a big one.
It is. The edict basically says that everyone, no matter what religion they follow, gets to enjoy the same rights and freedoms. Like, no one gets special treatment or gets left out.
That's so forward-thinking for that time period. It's almost like a precursor to modern human rights ideas.
Right. It's acknowledging that people have inherent rights just because they're human. And get this, they even created this whole new system for making laws. It's called the Supreme Council of Judicial Ordinances, or Meclisi Valaya Akama Adli in Turkish.
Wow, that's a mouthful. What did that council actually do?
So instead of the Sultan just, snapping his fingers and making laws, he now had to work with this council. They would debate and draft new laws, and then the Sultan would give his final approval. It's like a step towards having more voices involved in the lawmaking process.
That's super interesting. It's not full-blown democracy or anything, but it's definitely a step in the direction of having more checks and balances.
Right. It's recognizing that the Sultan's power shouldn't be unlimited. Now, let's break down those specific rights and freedoms that the edict lays out. We've got the right to personal inviolability and security, which sounds super important.
What did that actually mean in, like, real-world terms?
It meant that everyone had the right to be safe, to have their honor and dignity respected, and no one could just accuse them of stuff or punish them without a good reason. It's like that principle we talked about earlier, no crime or punishment without law. And the whole public trial thing also falls under this right, because it makes the legal process fair and transparent.
Yeah, it's all about protecting people from arbitrary power, right?
Exactly. And another principle they bring in is the personality of penalties. It's this idea that if you do something wrong, you're the one who gets punished, not your kids or your family. Like, your punishment shouldn't be passed down to future generations. It's about individual responsibility.
That's such a huge step away from those old ideas of collective punishment, where whole families could be held responsible for one person's actions.
Yeah, it's a much fairer way of thinking about justice. And the edict also talks about protecting private property. It says that people should be free to do what they want with their stuff, buy it, sell it, manage it, without the government just coming in and taking it away from them.
So it's about protecting individual wealth and economic freedom.
Totally. It's about creating a stable environment where people can own things and feel secure in that ownership. And remember that tax farming system we talked about, the iltizam?
Yeah, that didn't sound so great.
Yeah, well, the edict got rid of that. It said that taxes had to be based on what people could afford, like their property and their income. No more exploiting people through unfair taxes.
So it's like introducing this idea of progressive taxation, where the more you have, the more you contribute.
Exactly. It's about making the tax system fair and equitable. And finally, they even addressed the issue of military recruitment. The edict basically said, look, we need to be fair about how we choose who gets drafted. No more playing favorites or exploiting people.
So it's like across the board, this edict is trying to create a more just and fair system for everyone.
Yeah, that's a great way to sum it up. It's like this blueprint for a society that's based on law, equality, and fundamental rights.
So it wasn't a formal constitution, but just like the Sened-i İttifak, it's considered a constitutional document in that material sense again. But this time, the lecture notes call it an edict-type document. What's the difference?
It all comes down to who's calling the shots. Remember, the Sened-i İttifak was this agreement between different groups, kind of like a compromise. But the Tanzimat was all about the Sultan saying, hey, I'm in charge and this is how things are going to be from now on. He's voluntarily limiting his own power and giving people these rights and freedoms. It's coming from the top down.
So it's more about the Sultan reforming the system on his own terms.
Exactly. And it's still incredibly significant. Historians consider it the very first time that fundamental rights were officially recognized for Turkish citizens. It's a landmark moment.
Yeah, it sets the stage for everything that comes after. And the fact that it made the Sultan and the government officials accountable to the law, that's a huge shift in thinking, too.
It is. It's saying that no one is above the law, not even the most powerful person in the land. It's a key principle of any constitutional system.
Okay, so we've looked at the Sened-i İttifak, we've explored the Tanzimat, these two like foundational documents. What's the big takeaway here? What does this tell us about how Turkish constitutional law started to take shape?
It's like we've seen two different paths emerging, right? Sened-i İttifak was all about this agreement, this coming together of different power players to like hash things out and find common ground. Then we have the Tanzimat Fermani, which is more like a decree that comes straight from the Sultan, this top-down approach to reform. But both of them, in their own way, are taking these huge T steps towards recognizing that power can't be unlimited and that people have rights that need to be protected.
I love that. It's like two different approaches to achieving a similar goal. So for our listeners out there, what resonates most with you? Is it that delicate balancing act in the Charter of Alliance where the Sultan and the regional leaders are trying to figure out how to share power? Or is it those early ideas about rights and freedoms that we see in the Edict of Tanzimat?
Both are super important, but yeah, think about what resonated most with you, what really stood out.
We've only scratched the surface here. This deep dive into the Sened-i İttifak and the Tanzimat Fermani is just the beginning. There's so much more to discover about Turkish constitutional law.
Yeah, and it just gets more and more fascinating as we move through history.
We definitely encourage everyone to keep digging into this stuff. It's amazing to think about how these ideas were shaping society back then, even if putting them into practice was a real struggle. Think about how people felt when these principles were first announced, even if they weren't perfectly implemented right away. What questions do you have after learning about these early attempts at constitutionalism? Like, how do you think these documents impacted the development of the Turkish constitution as we know it today?
Yeah, let's keep the conversation going in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts, your burning questions, anything that popped into your head while listening to this.
Absolutely. What are you curious about next? What other aspects of Turkish constitutional law do you want us to explore? Let us know in the comments, and we'll make sure to cover it in a future deep dive.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, hit that subscribe button and give this video a big thumbs up.
We'll be back soon with more fascinating insights into the Turkish legal system. Until then, keep exploring and keep those legal minds sharp.